So now we're assessing democracy 0.02. Now with that idea in mind about why governments were created, presumably you know that not all governments are equally committed to the idea of providing liberty, and not all governments are equally committed to the idea of going ahead and creating order. Some of them create a lot of order and very little liberty. Some of them create more liberty and less order. So I want to talk about different types of governments, and we're going to talk about a few. First, there's what's called totalitarian government, a totalitarian government. Now, a totalitarian government is one in which the government controls all aspects of political and economic life. They control everything. They determine who you can socialize with. They determine where you're going to work. They determine how much you're going to get paid. Now, an example of a socialist government right now would be, a really good example would be North Korea. North Korea is a totalitarian form of government. The government controls everything there. You can't do anything without government approval there. Alternatively, there's something called authoritarian governments. Now, authoritarian governments are oftentimes people confuse authoritarian and totalitarian, and there is a difference, an important difference. In an authoritarian government, the government itself is controlled by a ruler or controlled by a party. Might be the Communist Party might control it, or there may be a particular leader, like in North Korea, where there's one person who controls it. Even if he represents the party, it's that one person who really is in charge of everything. But in an authoritarian government, unlike places like North Korea, other institutions exist that are not fully controlled by the government. Let me give you a good example. It's a historical example, but it's still a very good example. Is Poland. Poland, during the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was still in place, was an example of an authoritarian government. The Communist Party controlled everything, right? They were in charge of everything. So the Communist Party was there, it controlled everything. But it wasn't a totalitarian system, because at the same time that the government existed and was in control, the Catholic Church existed as well. And the Catholic Church was an independent, like, sort of institution on its own. And the government could not have tried to beat down the Catholic Church without creating a massive revolution. So what you have in an authoritarian government is you have the government controlling everything and being controlled by a ruler or by party, the same way as a totalitarian government exists. But there are other institutions within society that aren't controlled by the government. There are some people who say that China is becoming more and more like an authoritarian government, because a lot of the businesses, the businesses in China sort of function on their own. It's not like the government can just tell everybody what to do. So that's another kind of government. Then there's something called a theocracy. A theocracy is when the government is controlled by religious leaders. That religious leaders are the ones who decide what's going to happen in a society. Now, I'm not talking about, like, it used to be, well, okay, let me give you an example of what is a religious theocracy. Iran. The government of Iran is theocratic. It is a theocracy. The people who have the power, most power, are the mullahs, the high, essentially, priests in the country. They're called imams, so it's different, or ayatollahs actually is what they're called. But they are essentially religious leaders, and they set the rules for what the government can and cannot do. So the government is actually controlled by religious leaders. Now, sometimes students think, like Turkey. Turkey is an Islamic government, right? That it's basically everybody in the government is Islamic. And so sometimes students think, well, that's a theocratic government. That's a theocracy. No, it's not the case, because even though everybody is a Muslim, or almost everybody is Muslim, there are certainly other religions, but even though everybody's it's overwhelmingly Muslim, it's not run by religious leaders. They have a democracy, and the democratic form of government is what the leaders are the ones who decide what is and isn't going to happen. The religious leaders can't just dictate what's going to go on. In Iran, they can. In Iran, they most definitely can. So a theocracy is when the government is in control, is controlled by religious leaders. Now, a democracy is different. A democracy, and this is what we have, although there's sort of disagreements about sort of how democratic we are, but in the way that we're going to be using this term, a democracy is a system of government in which political authority, and what I mean by political authority, that is the right to rule, the political authority is vested in the people. That any political leader who goes ahead and exercises political power in a democracy does so basically on our behalf. All political power comes from the people. It comes from the people. And when they vote, they're using our political power to vote. So when our senators or our congressmen are voting, they're basically using our political power. When we vote for them, basically what we're saying is, hey, here's my political power. I'm voting for you. Go ahead and use it. Use it wisely, because otherwise I'll vote you out of office. Right? That's the idea. Now, there are different kinds of democracy, because the power is vested in the people. We have the power. And there are two different kinds of democracy that I'm going to talk about briefly. One is what we'll call pure democracy. Pure democracy. And in pure democracy, what happens is the citizens are actually the decision makers. We're the ones who go ahead and, as citizens, we decide what laws are going to be passed and what laws are not going to be passed. Now, back in Athens, in Greece, they had pure democracies. When they were making a decision about what was going to happen in Athens, all the voting citizens, which meant basically males with a certain amount of property, but all the sort of voting citizens would get together at one place, and they would debate and discuss what they were going to do. And then the citizens would go ahead and vote and decide what policies the Athens was going to adopt, and then that would become the law. The citizens are actually in there debating, discussing, and then they go ahead and vote, and that becomes a law. That's a pure democracy. In some places in New England, they have very close to pure democracies in some of these little towns, where if the town is getting ready to make a decision about, are we going to put a stop sign, near the center square or something like that, the way they do it is everybody gets together, some community center, and they debate what they want to do, and they have a discussion, and then they vote. And when they vote, if most people want a sign there, a sign goes there. It's the citizens really participating. We can't really have a pure democracy in the United States, right? It really isn't very practical. We can't just say like, okay, look, everybody, we're all going to meet in Kansas and we're going to figure out what we're going to do. And then everybody in the United States collects in Kansas and we go ahead and try and figure out what we want to do. That would be crazy. It would never, ever, ever work. So we don't have a pure democracy in the United States. What we have is something called a representative democracy. Sometimes people call it a republic, a representative democracy. And that is that we don't actually make the decisions ourselves. What we do is we elect people to go ahead and make decisions on our behalf. Right? So when you vote for, and you better vote, when you vote for your member of the House of Representatives, or you vote for governor, or you vote for president, basically what you're doing is you're saying, I want you to go ahead and vote on my behalf. I want you to go ahead and make votes, but think about what's in my best interest as well, not just your own. I'm not going to be making the decisions. You're not going to be making the decisions. They're going to be making the decisions for us. So instead of a pure democracy where we're actually debating the issues and then voting ourselves, in a representative democracy, we elect people to go ahead and go to Washington, D.C. or to Sacramento, and then they make the decisions there. That's a representative democracy. So those are the two basic categories: pure democracy, representative democracy, and there's a lot sort of area in between. Some countries have a little bit of both, as does the United States. There are some instances where, well, there aren't any instances where we participate individually as citizens, But in California, as we'll find out later on, there are sort of elements of pure democracy in California where citizens have the right to make the decision. At the federal level, it's almost all it's all just representative democracy. Now, with that in mind, what I want to talk about next are sort of different, what I on the lecture notes it says different types of democracies. What I mean by that is that there are certain people who have looked at our government and they've said, you know, this is how this government really works. And there are like some very different perspectives on what is actually happening in our government and what kind of government we actually have. So that's going to be the next video, which would be excuse me, Assessing Democracy 0.03.